Hi, thanks for tuning in to my official YouTube channel. I'm Reverend MeeLing, also known as Reverend Susan MeeLing, Lady MeeLing, Lady Dori, Belle. Been known by a few names. So, I have never hidden what was going on in reference to what happened to my daughter because of McCoy Elementary School of Carrollton Farmers Branch Independent School District. It was never a political aspect to discuss that because, I actually have and do care about my son and my daughter. And while, yes, I also obviously knew that my son and my daughter were not the only ones who dealt with certain things, unlike what certain people may have thought, it was never anything political. See, my ex-sisters-in-law, meaning Mary Evangelina Nichols Osteen and Susie Marie Nichols Lopez, if they had actually asked their older brother, the living one, not the dead one, not my dead ex-husband, but my living ex-brother-in-law and his wife, then my two ex-sisters-in-law, Mary Evangelina Nichols Osteen and Susie Marie Nichols Lopez, would have actually been able to get the truth about how my daughter and I were being treated at McCoy Elementary School of Carrollton Farmers Branch Independent School District in Carrollton, Texas. See, if my two ex-sisters-in-law, first and foremost, had actually cared about my son and my daughter, their nephew and their niece, then first off, they would have actually been helpful in a lot of ways in comparison to what they were. And in reference to those who I knew throughout the years that maybe didn't want to listen or pay attention to the reality, again, my ex-brother-in-law, Tony Walker Nichols, and his wife, Gail Nichols, had been informed of the way my daughter and I were being treated at McCoy Elementary School. How can I say this? How can I say that my ex-brother-in-law knew? It's very simple. I had to contact him because of being accused by the then principal, Dawn Rink, in November of 2009, of having an arsenal. So I had to contact my ex-brother-in-law to ask him to contact the principal at that time in November of 2009, Dawn Rink, to let her know that the firearms that my dead ex-husband had were given to my ex-brother-in-law after his death. And that was before the school district board meeting in May or June of 2010, after the school had refused to allow me to be at the Fort Worth Zoo field trip in April of 2009 or 2010. And from 2009 through to 2010, that also doesn't forget to include how many times I had repeatedly asked the school, McCoy Elementary School of Carrollton, Texas, of Carrollton Farmers Branch Independent School District, to actually get my daughter into special needs education. So if anybody were to wrongly, falsely, liably, and slanderously claim falsely that I was doing anything political in reference to that, if that were the case, wouldn't I have brought up all that stuff before what happened at the Fort Worth Zoo? The answer is yes to that rhetorical question. I would have contacted the news, right? Yes, that rhetorical question. I would have contacted law enforcement officials as far as elected officials earlier if that was a political thing. In those regards, if there were people who were making false claims, hypothetically, such as my ex-sisters-in-law and or my biological mother, my biological sister, anybody that I knew that had issues with me before any of that occurred. If it was, as a hypothetical individuals claiming that I was doing something political at that time, wouldn't I have contacted politicians before everything that had occurred? Yes, is the answer to that rhetorical question. So I take great offense to anyone and everyone who would falsely make the claim, which is slander and is liable, to falsely claim that I was doing anything at those times in a political statement. And if anybody at all were to have hypothetically claimed that I would put my children in danger, no, I'm not that type of person at all. I am the type of mom who actually cares and who actually had done everything in my possible capability to keep my children safe. Obviously, I would not have continuously attempted to get my daughter to be looked at into special needs education if I was in a hypothetical false claim to be doing that. Realistically. And for those who have known me over the years, like actually knew me, not assumed that they knew me, but actually knew me, then you would actually know that I don't do things, and especially back then, did not do things to garner false attention. Another example that you can look at in reference to my personal pattern of behavior: what happened with my now dead ex-husband? It took quite a bit of time before I actually contacted the senator for my area in Texas with what occurred. All of the stuff in reference to my now dead ex-husband and going up the chain of command, could I have contacted who I did, which is Senator Cornyn? I contacted Senator Cornyn months later because of not being able to get what was needed done on my own. Not because of any political attempt at all. And not in any offense to Senator Cornyn or any of the other elected officials that were in office in the state of Texas at that time. First, realistically, I didn't even know that that was a plausible way to go. I thought that the only way for me to make sure that all of the guys were taken care of as best as I possibly could, not just my son and my daughter being able to have that aspect at Fort Sam Houston, but also making sure that the other soldiers and their families were able to make sure that they were taken care of. That wasn't a political statement or move. That is what I actually did. Because I knew that once I got up to a certain point in the chain of command of the United States of America's Armed Forces Army Branch at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, that gave the guys from, and not being sexist, by the way, it's an East Coast term, that gave the guys the availability to be able to do stuff for themselves too. That wasn't, and again, not in any offense towards the elected officials at all. whatsoever. It was to make sure that they themselves knew, yes, you can rely on other things too, but you were taught in basic training. And obviously I didn't graduate basic training because of my head injury on Palm Sunday in 2000. But you were taught in basic training not only to rely on those that you are with, but also of your own ingenuity, to pay attention to your own stuff. And so my own intuition, which not ingenuity, just intuition, was to make sure that those guys were able, what is the proverb in reference to, you can give a man a fish and he could eat for a day. You could teach a man to fish and he can eat for a lifetime. So those guys, not only were they able to get themselves squared away, but they were also able to pass that information on to each and every individual that they themselves knew, and so on and so forth down the line, as I went up the chain of command. So that way it was a two-way aspect where the guys in medical hold unit, or now or even then warrior transition unit, as well as each area that I went to, in full respect, mind you, just as I did with McCoy Elementary School, I was respectful, despite the fact that they didn't like how I look. All of those guys at Fort Sam Houston, and then in turn throughout the rest of the different branches, because I had hoped that those guys that I would speak with, despite some of them being upset, that they'd at least be able to see, you know what, she actually cares. Because and obviously dead ex-husband don't care in that regard, but caring about my son and my daughter, but also making sure that the different soldiers, whether they were going to stay in or they were going to go out, either way, that they were able to take care of themselves, as well as letting their other brothers and sisters in arms, by genuinity, to be able to make sure that they took care of themselves. Because there is a certain aspect when it comes to the military of the United States of America's Armed Forces where, unlike in reference to the police officers who are sent out in pairs, and police officers, they're accustomed to, you know, relying on their partner, but also relying on themselves. Law enforcement has that. Whereas military guys, they're taught to be in groups. Even to special forces guys, you know, those realistically have that combined aspect where they are taught not only to trust their own ingenuity, but also to be able to work with their group and make sure their group is okay. So with the aspects of what I did in that regard, that wasn't a political move at all. That was to make sure that those guys were able to take care of themselves as well. Politics is in an overall elected official sort of way, at least that's my understanding of it. And so those guys being able to take care of themselves and then also give warnings and advice and different aspects to pay attention to, whichever rank they were. Because realistically, if they weren't in military uniform, I didn't know what rank they were. So it didn't matter whether they were an E1 or an O10. They were able to get whatever they needed, and they were able to get the information, not just for themselves, and see different ways to help themselves, but also others. So that way they didn't have to always have that, okay, got to go up the chain of command sort of thing. Not to have a rebellion or a revolt, of course, to be able to, okay, they're getting out of the military, they're able to keep certain things in mind to make sure that they're able to be taken care of. And then the ones that had certain difficulties because of the injuries that they had sustained while being active duty or overseas or whatever happened, that their families that would have to make sure that their family members were taken care of because of the problems that occurred after their injuries, their family members were able to be taken care of and squared away. So if there's like a guy, male or female is what it is, but the damage to whatever happened to their injury, their parents, their aunts, their uncles, their grandparents, whoever it is, whoever it was, were able to get that ability for their own understanding to best assist as well. To make sure that their guy didn't have to endure what I did after my head injury on Palm Sunday in 2000 and the after effects of. I didn't have to do that. That wasn't a political move. That was just to make sure those guys were actually able to get themselves squared away and taken care of, as well as their family members and their friends. Being able to genuinely have that community, not just because of their time in the service of whichever branch of the United States of America's Armed Forces, but outside, once out of the military, whatever branch, whatever rank, however they got out, whatever it was, they were able to have that. So, and again, not in any offense to Senator Cornyn or also the White House at that time that I had contacted, those were my last resort to contact. Not in any offense towards them either, though. Because if I had gone straight to them, then all of those guys would have only gotten the filtered version. They wouldn't have seen all of the other stuff that they themselves needed to look at paying attention to. And in turn, they also, as far as the guys who were looking at going in, would be able to have that asking of prior guys for actual understanding before they signed the dotted line. So that way they knew what they needed to look at to make sure that everything was taken care of, because it's not as simple as just a will when you go in. Because the will is only if you don't live. That's it. The other aspects of when you go in, if you get injured beyond certain aspects, you're still alive. That will means nothing at that point. And so making sure those guys are actually being taken care of in a genuine fashion and being able to take care of themselves as best as possible. And then grow from that so that way they could prosper in ways that, you know, prior generations have had issues in certain references. And then when, yes, getting to a certain point, there's no denying, once I got to a certain point, meaning the 2-star general at Fort Sam Houston, in his office and that whole thing, when it got to that point and there was no other way, okay, well then now what do I do? Who do I contact now? Because obviously I could only go so far in that reference point. And that would be when, yes, I got the San Antonio Express News involved and asked them for assistance, as well as contacting Senator Cornyn, as well as the White House at that time. Not wanting to bother them because of knowing that there was a whole bunch of other stuff that they were dealing with on top of which. Not saying that that isn't part of their job. Obviously it is. But knowing that there's stuff that they were dealing with as well. And so trying to do what I could in a way that, you know, not affecting them unless absolutely having to go and contact them. And so when I finally actually did, I'm sure that in certain regards, well, what took you so long could have been some thoughts in that regard. But at the other aspect of knowing, when looking at stuff as far as how far I had gone, the ability for them to kind of be like, so they're actually going to be able to take care of themselves a little bit better. Okay. All right. And so making sure that I didn't disrupt anything as best as possible, while at the same time of making sure that there was genuine stuff being taken care of. So conversely, in reference to what occurred to my daughter, and then in turn my son, the exact same pattern of behavior, if you actually look at it, in regards of trying to work with the school and the school district from the time of enrolling my children into McCoy Elementary School in 2008, all the way through 2008 into 2009, repeatedly asking the kindergarten teacher for my daughter as well as the guidance counselor at the time, Angela Ryder, as well as the principal at the time, Dawn Rink, from 2008 to 2009, when my daughter was in kindergarten. Because of already having taken my daughter to a pediatrician to try to get a referral. But the pediatrician saying, well, we need a note from the school. And then the school refusing to give me a note to give that to the pediatrician to get the referral for my daughter to be evaluated for at least therapy. And then the aspects in reference to getting her special needs education for being bullied, of all things. So if it was a political thing, as some might have falsely claimed against me, then wouldn't I have contacted more in 2008 and 2009 before my daughter was in first grade, mind you? Because when my daughter was in first grade, that would be November of 2009, when my now ex-brother-in-law was contacted in reference to the arsenal claim from then Principal Dawn Rink, which, again, my daughter only broke into the shadow box that I had made for her and the shadow box I made for her brother with the 21 gun salute spent shell casings to get those because of being tired of being bullied. Wouldn't I have done if it was a political thing, wouldn't I have gone and contacted all those peoples beforehand? If that was the case? Or if, since it was not a political thing, I would have done exactly as I did. Correct? Yes. Rhetorical question. Correct. And then, even then, at that point, that technically could have been a political thing, right? I would guesstimate some NRA guys might be like, that would have been perfect for political stuff. But my son and my daughter, I wasn't using for political stuff. That wasn't what it was. What actually was of importance was and is my son and my daughter. So then in 2010, from 2008 to 2010, constantly dealing with stuff a lot longer than in reference to what happened at Fort Sam Houston. Not political. Just genuinely trying to get stuff taken care of. And it wasn't until 2010 that I had put it out as far as what occurred to my daughter because of the prior stuff that had been going on repeatedly. Again, similarly to in reference of military guys and knowing my son and my daughter were not the only ones who had certain things going on. My ex-in-laws, meaning my ex-father-in-law and my ex-mother-in-law, getting answers in what ways I could. Making sure taken care of. And then only because of knowing and getting to that point, because of having to figure that out, getting others involved. But still giving the ability for, from the ground up, to be able to get their stuff squared away. So in reference to what happened to my daughter and in turn my son, knowing my daughter was not the only one who had experienced stuff like that. My son was not the only one who had experienced the after effects of something like that. And I was not the only parent who had been dealing with certain aspects like that. Not just because of how I look, that could be one aspect. Not just because of spiritual religious background, though that could be another aspect. Not just because of how the military background, not the only one with that aspect. So on and so forth. Not the only one. So when I finally made the choice to actually put it out there and be like, okay, well, you know what? This is what happened as far as the Fort Worth Zoo. And then everything afterwards, and not forgetting the stuff beforehand, but obviously at that point, that was when the straw that broke the camel's back, proverbially. When McCoy Elementary School, the staff members and the adult volunteers who had been bullying my daughter all that particular year, and then as far as the adult volunteers the year prior, with the children of the class, that was when I contacted because of them losing my daughter at the Fort Worth Zoo and leaving her unattended. Because at that point, I had already exhausted all resources, but tried to find other ways. Then and only then did I start looking at lawyers. So it took from 2008 to 2010 to look at lawyers. So I have a massively huge amount of resentment if anybody were to falsely, slanderously, and liably claim anything beyond me caring about my daughter, my son, and yes, when I actually came forward and spoke about it, making sure that other parents, whatever level they were at, whether parents taking care of children, grandparents taking care of children, legal guardians taking care of children, aunts, uncles, however that would be. Yes, when actually coming out as far as saying the stuff because of the Fort Worth Zoo, similarly to the military guys, making sure that they were able to make sure that their children were safe while still trying to do what I could to make sure my daughter and my son were taken care of. And not being able to get a lawyer. Because at that time, in 2010, the amount of stuff was so much that every lawyer I spoke with, emailed, whatever, oh, that's too big for our britches. Obviously not knowing about the hacking or the stalking in that regard, of course. But again, in reference to my ex-sisters-in-law, specifically Susie Marie Nichols Lopez, as many government programs as she had gone through, if she had actually cared, wouldn't she have actually assisted in that regard? But as my ex-sister-in-law, Susie Marie Nichols Lopez, said, if it was my son, she'd care. I doubt it. I highly doubt it. I highly doubt that that female would do anything. And I've said it before. I did not believe Susie Marie Nichols Lopez would care if it was my son. Because of how she was. And I doubt my son would actually believe that Susie Marie Nichols Lopez would care after certain things that he himself saw. And as far as my other ex-sister-in-law, Mary Evangelina Nichols Osteen, she didn't care either way because she wasn't the center of attention, just like Susie Marie Nichols Lopez, wanting to be the center of attention. If I was inaccurate, then here's proof. My ex-sister-in-law, Susie Marie Nichols Lopez, had contacted an artist to make a painting for her and her mom of my dead ex-husband, her dead brother, but was so eager to take my son, and it was an inconvenience that my daughter couldn't go. I was not invited, by the way. I was not asked to go, but I was asked if they could use my car to go. I did not contact that artist, but Susie Marie Nichols Lopez complained because he wouldn't do the painting of my dead ex-husband in the dress blues, which that in its own right should have pointed out the fact that what the Chief Warrant Officer 3 had discussed at the funeral of my dead ex-husband and him stealing valor in proof. Because a guy doing artwork, painting of portraits for military guys would probably know and be able to research to ensure whatever medals and ribbons on would be valid. However, I wasn't invited. And I didn't contact. Susie Marie Nichols Lopez did, because she wanted to be front and center. And she only did that after she had gotten her surgeries. I didn't have any surgeries when I contacted his reference for the military guys. I had my hair color, I had some of my tattoos. I didn't have any of the surgeries because that didn't matter to me, what I physically looked like. What mattered to me was that everybody was taken care of in a genuine way. So it would absolutely be incredibly insulting if I were to find out, especially if it was my ex-sisters-in-law, and or my biological mother and or my biological sister wanting to claim that, because neither one of them, in reference to my biological mother and biological sister, neither one of them knew how much I had gone up the chain of command. They had no idea. We weren't speaking at that time. So they had no idea as far as how and what I did before contacting news and political figures as a last resort, because there was nothing more I could think of to do to try to not only help my children, but also the others that had and have similar certain situations and backgrounds. So that way they themselves didn't have to go through what I was going through as mom. So that way their children didn't have to go through whether they were in situations similar to my daughter or situations similar to my son. Because while I only had 2 children, there are people who have more than 2 children. So, having that aspect where all can look at that and be like more attentive, paying more attention to not just their children, but their children's education, so that way they genuinely are taken care of. Especially in comparison to what was going on because of McCoy Elementary School. And if, especially in regards to my ex-sisters-in-law and my biological mother and biological sister, if they had actually cared, they would have done stuff to actually help my daughter, my son, and I, instead of what it was they chose not to do. So no, it was never a political aspect in regards of elected official stuff. Because realistically, I never thought of myself as being a politician or even looking into going into politics. Because everybody I've ever seen in politics doesn't look like me. There is not one politician that has been in an elected office that has a hairstyle or color similar to mine. There is not an elected official in office that I've seen that has visible tattoos. Male or female, by the way. And while I don't deny I did not vote for Hitler for a multitude of reasons, and despite certain aspects that I obviously do not agree with, it had nothing to do with her being a female. But obviously females being involved in politics and running has been around for a while. Not just her. There have been plenty of other, and there are plenty of other females that have been running and in elected office. I haven't seen any that look like me, though. I haven't seen any that have the similar type of background. So why would I think at all that I, of anybody, could be in any electable type of thing? I admit, this year in 2020 I did. But that wasn't back in 2008. That wasn't back in 2010. That wasn't even back when I was continuing on in reference from 2010 all the way through 2013. That was never a thought in my mind. It didn't even come into my thoughts until 2000, or maybe 2019. I think it was 2019 I met Marta. I think it was, okay, so 2019, my mistake on the year. But even still, I look as I do. Have you, ever seen anybody that has visible tattoos that cannot be hidden? No? Okay. No? Okay. So that wasn't a thought process, and I am offended if that had been a thing as far as thoughts. Because no, my son and my daughter were never something that I looked at as political toys. My son and my daughter, I always looked at as my son and my daughter. You know, being a mom. I never looked at the guys in the military that I had gone to inform. I didn't look at them as political toys. I looked at them as guys that needed to know and be aware as human beings. So that way they themselves could also take care of themselves. I didn't look at what happened as far as McCoy Elementary School as a political thing. I looked at as my son and my daughter, making sure they were taken care of. And then yes, as I did write about it, post about it, all that sort of stuff, discussed it. Wasn't for political aspects. That was simply to make sure that while I couldn't find out ways to do anything in a greater aspect for my son and my daughter, at least maybe somebody else could prevent that from happening to their child or children. Similarly to the military guys. Not caring in regards to who I was speaking with, because it didn't matter to me whether they were male or female. Where I knew them at, what their backgrounds were, what their spiritual, sexual, it did not matter. What mattered was making sure the children were actually taken care of. And in reference to my Medal of Honor art project, that definitely was not political. I would not have been as excited as I genuinely have been and am about my Medal of Honor art project. Because they were Medal of Honor recipients, that's a top award. That's not a political statement. That's what they earned. And yes, I do admit, I did send a message to then candidate, but now President of the United States of America, Donald Trump, letting him know that the ones that I had been working on that were in my possession at the time, because they were still in the house, I hadn't delivered them yet, those particular spirits of those particular Medal of Honor recipients very much supported what he was doing and what he was running on. And are very glad, just as I am, and just as the majority of people who voted for him are, that he became president and is president of the United States of America in 2020. Again, depending on what you believe spiritually. However, yes, my ex-brother-in-law would know back in 2009, November, about that from the principal. And the emails back and forth between him and her. And him being in Oklahoma and her being from Oklahoma, that probably was a bit of a... for him to be like, wait, she's from Oklahoma? And she doesn't know the difference between a spent shell casing and a used one? Just saying. So, it's never political for me. It was out of genuine care and concern. And when it came to my son and my daughter, and it comes to my son and my daughter, what somebody's job is or isn't was not my concern. Anybody who is taking care of children is taking care of children. That's what mattered. And there are plenty of guys who have already gone through what I went through, my son, my daughter, in varying degrees. So, that's what I have to say in my official YouTube channel. And all while dealing with the after effects from my scuba dive in the Malleus Abyss when going to the Vandenberg. You guys